"Look here," Judah said to the others. "Here come some Ishmaelites. Let's sell Joseph to them. Why kill him and have a guilty conscience? Let's not be responsible for his death, for after all, he is our brother." And his brothers agreed. So when the traders came by, his brothers pulled Joseph out of the well and sold him to them for 20 pieces of silver, and they took him along to Egypt. Then, as the story ends and the brothers have returned to Egypt to look for food, we see that they are reunited then with Joseph. And our verse in 45 tells of that reunion. It says, "Come over here," he said. So the brothers came closer, and he said to them, "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be angry with yourselves that you did this to me, for God did it. He sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. These 2 years of famine will grow to 7, during which time there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God has sent me here to keep you and your families alive, so that you will become a great nation. Yes, it was God who sent me here, not you. And he has made me a counselor to Pharaoh and a manager of this entire nation, ruler of all the land of Egypt." Now, we've been studying the last few weeks of Abraham. And we had heard how God had originally called Abraham to be the forefather of the Israelite people, God's chosen. And we have seen how God had promised Abraham to have a son named Isaac. And he does indeed have this son of promise, the son through whom God would fulfill this covenant that he had made with Abraham. And eventually, through this son, Isaac, Abraham would have 2 grandsons, Esau and Jacob. But just as there had been family dysfunction and jealousy between the 2 brothers born, or the 2 sons born to Abraham, Ishmael that we had heard about, as well as Isaac, born to Sarah, we see that this jealousy and this controversy continues through the generations and on into Abraham's grandsons. Isaac's youngest son, Jacob, actually manages to trick his older brother Esau out of his inheritance and steal his birthright, causing immense trouble between these 2 brothers. Later, Jacob would wrestle with an angel of God who would bless Jacob, and he would change his name to Israel. And now, as a grown man, Jacob, or Israel, as he has been known, would eventually have a total of 12 sons. And these 12 sons would become known throughout the Bible as the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob, as a young man, had worked for 7 years for a man named Laban in order to be allowed to marry this man's daughter Rachel. But instead, Laban forces Jacob, after those 7 years, to marry the older daughter Leah instead. And so Jacob has to start over, and he works another 7 years in order to marry the woman that he truly loves, Rachel. Now, out of the 12 sons that Jacob has, only 2 of these sons actually were born to Rachel. And so Jacob, because he loved Rachel more, he in turn loved these 2 sons more. Now, Rachel actually lost her life. She died in childbirth, giving birth to the youngest one, Benjamin. And as our story opens, we can see that Joseph, the older of these 2, is now 17 years old when our story takes place. Now, hopefully at our age, we can laugh about most of the things that had went on throughout our childhood. But if we as children felt that our mom or dad loved one of our brothers or sisters more than they loved us, well, that can be a very painful wound that we often carry throughout our lives. And it can cause not only hurt feelings towards our parents, but it can cause jealousy towards those siblings. And jealousy, we know, is a very dangerous thing. And that's what we see here in our story today. Jacob's other 11 sons were jealous of the favor that had been shown towards Joseph by their father. this jealousy actually caused them to conjure up all these evil things that they wanted to do to Joseph. In fact, they not only wanted to hurt him, they originally had planned to kill him. You see, Joseph, he recognized that his father favored him more, and he was not quite so humble about it sometimes in front of his brothers. In fact, most of the time it was probably just the opposite. He was the one who would run home and he would tattle on every wrong thing that he saw his brothers do. And as you can imagine, this would not have endeared him to these brothers. To make matters worse, between Joseph and his brothers, two things had happened. First, Joseph's dad, Jacob, gives him a coat. A special coat of a lot of different colors that was made for him alone. A little too obvious, maybe with the favoritism on Jacob's part, but I can easily see Joseph strutting around in this coat at every opportunity. And then the next thing is that Joseph has two dreams. In the first dream, Joseph and his brothers are working out in the fields, and they're tying up sheaves of wheat. And the sheaves belonging to the brothers actually circle around the one of Joseph's and actually bow down to it. Then, in another dream, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars actually bow down to Joseph's star, indicating that not only his brothers, but this time also his parents would one day bow before him. So now you can see that these dreams apparently seem to be the very last straw for these brothers. After all, it was bad enough that Joseph flaunted his father's favoritism before them with the coat. But now Joseph is telling them that he will rise up as if he's royalty, and they should bow down to him, or that one day they will bow down to him. And this seems to be a little bit too much for them. So one day, as Joseph is asked by his father to check on these brothers as they tender sheep, they decide that is when they will murder him. However, Reuben, the eldest, seems to have a little bit more sense and responsibility than the others, and he talks them out of murder, but instead suggests that maybe they just throw Joseph into a dry well. Reuben had planned to go back later and free Joseph, but while Reuben is away, the other brothers decide to sell Joseph off to this caravan that is traveling to Egypt. They then dip his fancy coat in goat blood and take it to their father, claiming that Joseph had possibly been killed by a wild animal. Now, if these brothers thought that with Joseph gone, that Jacob would begin to favor them again, they were mistaken. Instead, Jacob says that he will love and grieve for this dead son forever. Now, meanwhile, we have Joseph in Egypt. And he too has been having some problems of his own since the years that he had been sold into slavery and since he had arrived in Egypt. He is now sort of a slave servant in the home of a high public official named Potiphar. And Potiphar's wife has taken an unfortunate liking to Joseph. And so every turn that Joseph makes, she is right there trying to get him to come with her. And when Joseph turns down her advances, she tells her husband Potiphar that Joseph had tried to attack her. And so even though Joseph was innocent and had not been doing that, he gets thrown into jail for several years, into prison. Later, Joseph is finally released from prison after he is able to interpret a recurring dream that Pharaoh has had. The dream foretells of a famine that will strike the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh then decides to put Joseph in charge of these storehouses and the distribution of food to the people. Now, in fact, Joseph has suddenly gone, as we see, from life in prison to life in a palace. From being a convicted criminal to now being a high-ranking official, only to Pharaoh himself. Joseph's own brothers, these same brothers who had sent him there to Egypt as a slave, eventually have to travel to Egypt themselves for food because of the extent of the famine. and the extent of how far it had reached. It had actually reached into the land of Canaan where they had been living. But they must go through Joseph in order to get this food that they need. They must come to and barter with this brother who they had wanted to originally kill out of jealousy. This same brother who had been sold into slavery and who had been allowed to be taken away by slave traders to Egypt. This was the same brother who they had convinced their father was dead, allowing their father to believe for years that this beloved son of theirs had been brutally killed by wild animals. They don't recognize Joseph as this same young brother because he had left as a young boy, and now here he is. He's a grown man. He's been through so many things, and he has changed. So they don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes them. And when he finally tells them that he is their brother, the one that they had sold into slavery, they actually become very frightened. You see, they think finally Joseph will get his revenge for the things that had been done to him. And so Joseph, he kind of takes pity on them. He has forgiven them, and he tells them not to be frightened for what they had planned for evil. God had actually used for good. He said God had a purpose for his life, and that God had actually been in control this whole time. And Joseph had realized that God was the one who had needed him to be in Egypt at that particular time in history, so that he could save this family, so that he could preserve these 12 tribes of Israel who were God's chosen. You know, so often we wonder what our purpose in life is. Maybe sometimes we don't even feel like we have one. When I had spoke this week with our youngest daughter, she had asked me what my message was, and I had told her, and her response was, well, I don't know what my purpose is either, but I know I have one. You see, that showed her faith. And hopefully we too can look at our life and we can say the same thing. Our purpose in this life is not always easy to determine. But we need to be assured that you also have one and that God has a purpose for you. God has placed you, like Joseph, in the exact spot where he needed you to be in order to fulfill his plan. Whatever that plan may look like. And as long as God knows what that plan and that purpose is, we don't have to lay awake at night wondering what it is. We just have to be reassured that God has it all under control. You know, so many times we don't like what we have to go through in life. You know, life can be very hard. And you might think that surely what you are going through could not be God's purpose for your life. And I am almost positive that Joseph did not want to be sold into slavery, torn away from his family at such a young age. I'm equally positive that Joseph probably did not enjoy his time in prison. And he was probably not eager to stay there any longer than he had to. But there was a purpose in all of that. You see, without being sold to the slave traders' caravan, Joseph would not have traveled to Egypt on his own. If Joseph would not have been in prison, he would never have heard about the dream that kept plaguing Pharaoh and how Pharaoh had wished to have somebody interpret this dream. Joseph would not have been elevated to such a high position in Egypt, one in which he could help so many people, including his own family. You know, so many times throughout the story of Joseph, we find the phrase, "and the Lord was with him." The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. It also says his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord gave him success in everything that he did. It tells us Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant, and Potiphar put him in charge of his entire household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. You know, so many times we have been talking about our journeys that we take, and especially this journey that we have started on together here at Saito. And we have been talking about how God has called us to start out on our journey to follow Him, and we have talked about the wrong and misguided steps that can take us off the path and away from God's leading when we decide not to follow Him or to step ahead of His path. Last week, we even heard a message about how God wanted to bless us along this journey and give us the innermost desires of our heart, just as God did when He gave Abraham a son in his old age. And all we have to do is to love God and to be obedient to Him. In our very first message together, I had told you that oftentimes the journey is not pretty. It can be rough. Sometimes it's difficult. Sometimes it's unpleasant. But as we have seen today through this story of Joseph, God has a purpose for us to fulfill. God has a plan and a purpose for where He is taking us and for our future. You know, our purpose might not be very clear at this very moment. And like Joseph, we may have times when we question what God is doing and the things that we have went through and that we go through in the future. But we can be assured that God is traveling with us. And that like Joseph, the Lord was with him through every aspect of his journey. And the Lord is indeed with us as we continue on our journey and the purpose that God has for us to fulfill. And through not only us, but also through this church, for the people and the community around us. For we do have a purpose to show Christ to this community, and a purpose to show the love of Christ to the people around us, and a purpose to continue to move forward and to shine the light of Christ everywhere we go, and to glorify Christ in all that we say and do. We cannot let the past define us. For out of ashes, God brings beauty. And out of dry bones, God brings forth life. And out of our journey together will come forth a purpose. And we will continue to move forward on our journey to fulfill that purpose. Amen. Let us pray.